So welcome to this first in a series of workshops being organised relative to the Agile Initiative. This first session is on using a theory of change in an Agile sprint. So I'm just going to briefly explain what it is that we're going to try and cover in the next hour. We'll do some introductions in a minute. I just want to, and then we will be going through why and how we use a theory of change approach in the Agile Initiative. We will look at how to use a theory of change in practice, and we will be using a case study from one of our ongoing sprints to do that. And then throughout, there will be some opportunities for you to ask questions, but there will also be time at the end for some Q&A. So by the end of the workshop, we hope that you will understand how a basic theory of change has been used with the Agile sprints and how you can apply that approach to the design of rapid policy-focused research. How a theory of change can help you with scoping research goals, ensuring the applicability of your research findings to a range of stakeholders, and also define potential outcomes for those who are most affected by your research. And then the third aim is that you will understand how a theory of change can help you to organise and plan your research, and also work through interrelationships between work packages and how their integration supports planned impact. Okay, so just to introduce myself. So my name is Dr. Rachel Hayman. I am the Programme Manager for the Agile Initiative. I've been at Oxford University for just coming up to 3 years. I have a career that spans time in academia as an academic, also quite a lot of time in policy and practice, so working at the interface between research policy and practice. I've managed and contributed to a lot of large research and applied programs and projects, and I have used theory of change a lot over the last, I would say, 15 or so years. And in the last few years since joining Oxford, I have done some training on theory of change for different groups of researchers and research facilitators, both within Oxford, but also outside of Oxford as well. So I'm going to ask John to introduce himself next, please.
Yes, hi everyone, thanks for joining us. I'm John Lynch. I'm a researcher in the biology department at Oxford University. So previously, some of my research time was as a member of another sprint project, and now I have one day a week leading my mini sprint on how can we manage uncertainties in habitat greenhouse gas emissions. So I'll talk through especially on how the kind of theory of change process was useful and still being used in that project. So yeah, looking forward to going through it all and getting to know where everyone else is coming from.
This series of seminars was set up with quite a specific audience in mind, and that is researchers at Oxford who are either actively working on developing an Agile sprint research project, or who are hoping to potentially get involved in an Agile sprint project in the future. This is quite pitched about theory of change specifically to the Agile Initiative. I hope that you find it interesting and that there's some transferability of knowledge that you can take into other initiatives that you are working on. But please bear with us that that is the sort of pitch that we've got in this webinar today. Theory of change, I think, is used really quite widely. Well, it's used very widely in intervention programs and projects. So in sort of hands-on work of doing things, doing projects, doing programs. In research, it has become more and more introduced into research that is applied and that has a focus on impact. It was particularly introduced in the sort of early 2010s in relation to research linked with international development, and has since then sort of moved its way more broadly into the research space. I think it's an interesting tool to use within the research space, because I think it really helps with planning, implementing and evaluating research projects. It's a very useful tool in helping you to map out the links between research, the issues in the context that the research is trying to influence, and those longer term social development, economic or environmental outcomes that you're hoping that the research is going to contribute to. I find that theory of change is most useful when it's used from the outset of a research design process, and when you also use it to involve your stakeholders and potential users of the research in the design of the process itself. However, it's also a tool that can be used throughout a project to help a research team to respond to any changes that emerge during the project, and to really sort of think about how do you incorporate those changes and potential emerging outcomes into the research as it's going along. Perhaps the most valuable element of using theory of change in research is that it forces you to think beyond the activities that you're doing and think beyond those sort of more classic research outputs to the impact that you want your research to have, or the influence that you want your research to have further down the line. So when I'm talking about activities and outputs, I mean, doing research is an activity. So the literature review you might do, the modeling that you might do, the interviews, or whatever methodology you're using, those are all research activities. And from that, you will produce outputs. And those outputs might be your research publications. They may be non-academic publications, but that's basically activities to outputs. What we're trying to get at with the theory of change is to think further down the process towards, so what? What does somebody do with those outputs? What are the outcomes that you're hoping to achieve? And what are you hoping that the impact might be because of the research that you have done? So I'm going to just put this into the framework of the Agile Initiative itself. I'm just going to note that previous slide, it pulls on some interesting resources around theory of change in research, and at the end of the presentation and in the slides that will be shared and available, I have provided a list of some useful resources that you can go away and have a look at around theory of change as well. So so just to kind of bring things into the, what do we mean by theory of change within the Agile Initiative? So Agile was set up, we're now just into the third year of it, but to tackle a challenge that we had identified within, to tackle a challenge that we have identified, which is that if we are going to deal with the catastrophic environmental degradation that we're facing and deal with the interlinked issues of biodiversity loss and climate change, then we are going to have to move faster, and we're going to have to think differently about how researchers, policymakers, and actors actually come together to find solutions and deliver those solutions. So Agile is very much about ensuring that scientists and decision makers can work together much more rapidly across disciplines in order to deliver solutions to environmental challenges. So this is our theory of change. And I'm going to start on the right-hand side. So if we look at the right-hand side of this screen, in order to tackle that challenge that I have just mentioned, our vision is that we will produce a new model for academic institutions to work with decision makers to identify and respond to pressing environmental science research questions rapidly and effectively, mobilize the best interdisciplinary teams in order to tackle those issues. So we have a mission. To do that, we are going to experiment with ways to deliver rapid, agile, interdisciplinary research in the environmental sciences to meet the needs of decision makers, gathering evidence and learning to catalyze the changes that are required in institutional culture to enable this type of research to happen. To do this, we're going to slide over to the left-hand side of the slide. There are three main aspects to our work. Our pillars, and these are effectively the activities that we are doing in the Agile Initiative. So the first pillar of our work is to deliver evidence-based solutions to environmental science policy research questions through a new model of interdisciplinary, rapid interdisciplinary academic research, where we are co-creating with stakeholders and producing the outputs that are needed by decision makers in a relevant and timely manner. So that's our first pillar of work, our sprint research projects. Our second pillar of work is to create a cohort of interdisciplinary researchers with the capacity and the capability to do this type of research and meet the needs of decision makers. And thirdly, we're looking to contribute to a shift in research culture that enables this type of rapid solutions-focused research to happen, to identify the obstacles in the system and tackle them sort of as part of our project. And that includes academic career pathways and ways of doing interdisciplinary research. So that's, you know, if we are successful, we will start to see the outcomes that you'll see on the slide here, that we will have produced some solutions to some big problems. We will have a cohort of researchers who are skilled in doing this. We will have found a good way of co-creating research questions and areas with decision makers, and we will be producing evidence and learning on the factors that enable and hinder solutions-oriented research. And then onwards to impacts. If we have our, if we produce the impacts that we want to produce through this, we will be on course to achieve our mission and therefore our vision. So that's the program level. To drill down into the sprints. So the sprint research projects are these rapid projects that we are setting up in order to, and we're funding through the course of the Agile Initiative in order to move towards achieving these objectives. So within a sprint project, all sprints need to have a theory of change. It doesn't have to be using the particular model that we're going to show you, the tool that we're going to show you in this webinar, but you do need to have the core components of a theory of change within a sprint. It's not just used as a design tool in the initial phases, but it's something that we use throughout the course of the project to help keep the team on track, to monitor progress towards delivering the goals, and to also identify where shifts in direction might be necessary in responses to changes in the environment. So we use it to help teams think about outcomes and impact from the very start. And it's also used to enable the teams to produce results in a very short time frame. Our sprint projects are around about kind of up to a year in time, which is very short in research terms. So it's trying to help you to keep the research, the plans for the research realistic and manageable and deliverable within a short period of time. But we also sort of use the theory of change to not just think about the research, but to think about how you are engaging with users and stakeholders throughout the research, and also thinking about what does those outputs need to look like? What are those outcomes need to be if over the course of the research, you're actually going to be confident that the users of the research are going to take it and do something with it, ideally before the end of the sprint project. And we've seen that with some of the sprints that we've had so far. We're seeing early outcomes, we're seeing early impact because of the way in which the teams are working very closely with their users throughout. So, right, just to introduce so this is the sort of fairly basic model framework that we use for building the theory of change with sprint teams. As we're essentially building a pathway to impact. This is quite linear, but it seems to be working with the sprints that we've got in place so far. So what is this framework? Ultimately, we want you to start thinking about what you want to change, what you want to see that's different because that the research is going to contribute to. So we start with thinking about the context, the policy pool. What's the problem that the sprint is trying to resolve? What's it going to achieve in its lifetime? We use that reflection on the context and the policy pool to then think about the objectives. Okay, if you're going to produce a solution to that problem, what is it that the sprint is going to actually do? We are going to achieve X, Y, and Z, and those are the objectives. They feed into the goal, which you'll see in the pathway. So if we know what the policy pool is, we know what the objectives are, we can say this sprint is going to do X in its lifetime. This is the goal. And it should be, the goal should be something that's within the control of the sprint project. There's no point in having a goal that's 10 years down the line and that isn't something that you can control. It needs to be something that's manageable and realistic within the time frame. From there, we think about, so if that's the goal, what's the impact that you would hope to see? If the sprint is successful, what are the anticipated long-term effects that might result from the sprint? It's hard to control those things. We know it's hard to control the impact of research, but we want to think about what the potential scenarios are so that you kind of have a sense of what are we rooting for? What are we looking for in terms of impact? So if we're going to achieve that goal and those impacts, we then take ourselves back to the left-hand side and we really think about, well, how are we going to get there? What's the pathway that gets us from where we are now to that goal? So we think about the inputs. We think about the financial, the human, the knowledge, all the things that you've got that you bring into your sprint at the start. We think about the activities. What are the main actions that are going to be undertaken within the sprint? And these are also then reflected in your work plan and might include sort of cross-cutting activities across different work packages. But it's basically setting out under activities, in short, what you're going to do. The outputs column is about thinking about, so what's going to come out of that research? What are the products, the results, the tools, the services, whatever that's going to be produced as a result of your activities? These are the building blocks then towards your outcomes. And in the outcomes, we're trying to look at the effect. We're trying to think about what are those short-term, medium-term effects that we will see because of the outputs. So it's the changes you want to see. So, if you think about, if an activity is we're going to run a workshop, an output would be we did a workshop and we produced a report from that workshop. An outcome would be somebody who came to the workshop got really heavily invested in the results of that workshop and they've now done something with it. They've read it, they've shared it with colleagues, they've thought about how that builds into their policy. And ideally, the impact would then be that we see a change in policy or practice because somebody did something because of something that they heard at that workshop backwards down the chain. That's my very sort of simple example that just sort of talks you through that process. The final box that we have is the assumptions. It's really important in a theory of change to go, okay, but what are the assumptions we're making here? We're making assumptions that we can do this in time. We're making assumptions that our stakeholders are interested throughout, those sorts of things. So we use that as well. So we're going to think about how it applies in practice and how John's used it with his particular mini sprint. So over to you, John.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so we're just about halfway through this mini sprint, which is trying to address uncertainties in environmental greenhouse gas fluxes and use a kind of slightly deeper perspective on those uncertainties to enhance decision making. So we won't get hugely into the research itself, although bits of it will come through the process. But these are kind of uncertainties both in the physical, what are the greenhouse gas emissions themselves associated with different land uses, different agricultural managements, and then sort of decision related uncertainties in there's all different ways to compare different greenhouse gas emissions. So how do we kind of ensure appropriate decision making in light of these? So if we go on to the next slide, please, Rachel. Thank you. So I guess it was kind of in the first half of last year and last summer, I'd seen the call was out for the mini sprint projects, and I had a kind of research concept in mind that I thought would be useful and worth undertaking in general. And it was kind of the right sort of scope to potentially be done within a mini sprint, and also from a kind of academic career development perspective, was also a very nice opportunity to develop and lead a project as a kind of postdoctoral researcher in a way that I'd actually be able to do that within a feasible timeline. So I had the kind of research questions in mind, and then through some initially just kind of informal conversations with some stakeholders who had been involved in other projects or had been in touch about sort of relatively connected research questions, I then kind of pitch to them, well, here's this opportunity to develop mini projects, and I think this is where it could tie in for your kind of immediate decision making in a way that would be useful to them in terms of kind of actually resulting in decision making impacts, and be a very kind of timely policy pull as requested by the sprints. So within that context of these emission uncertainties, a lot of the case studies I was interested in and building on my own research background were things to do with environmental methane emissions from peatland management and from different kind of agricultural practices. So the wildlife trusts in England and DERA, who are the Department of Agriculture, Environment and Rural Affairs in Northern Ireland, are both very interested in getting a better handle on these uncertainties for their own kind of net zero planning. And there's a kind of especially timely policy pull in Northern Ireland because their Climate Change Act kind of has specific reference to kind of recognizing some of the distinctive properties of agricultural environmental methane. So there's kind of a policy opportunity and hopefully a chance to sort of actually help inform the decision making through doing this research now and underpinning that. So the kind of policy pull context, this was largely, well, I guess about half was kind of in my initial submission of interest to the project. And then as it kind of made it through that stage and we went into the co-creation with the stakeholders and Rachel coordinating through Agile, we then kind of fleshed it up into this even more specific policy pull through meetings with myself and the stakeholders. And then having that extra detail was kind of there in place to map out the theory of change. So yeah, I think that covers everything I was going to say on that one. If you want to move on, Rachel. Thank you. So from that kind of policy context and research question, we then, and again, this was part of that co-creation stage, we kind of took that general idea and the kind of slightly bigger picture way I'd framed it in the expression of interest, and then narrowed that down into some key objectives. So these kind of gave structure both in terms of what are the immediate objectives in terms of, well, what are we going to do? What numbers are we going to get out of it? Should note this is a desk-based kind of modeling project. But then also start thinking about those longer term parts. And so essentially beginning to address the kind of pathway from the outputs to the outcomes and the incomes in terms of what are our objectives to actually start achieving within the scope of the sprint itself. So then once we kind of, the project got underway through that co-creation process, fleshing these out, then it was through some kind of very initial meetings with the Agile Initiative that we then started putting it into that theory of change itself. So to answer one of the questions earlier, I guess for this project, the submission was framed in the slightly kind of more aggregated way here, and then it was only once it kicked off that I really started to think a bit more deeply about the theory of change. But if I'd been sort of a bit more embedded in it in the first place, then I think it could have been useful to have that as part of the proposal itself. So I don't think there's kind of a single way you have to do that, but useful to be aware of anyway. Okay, and I think ready for the next slide now then. So this is where it really starts to get fleshed out, as Rachel mentioned about mapping it out. So I think you can hopefully have an idea of what kind of the ambition of the project was. And then by kind of really thinking step by step within this theory of change context, it has been very useful to kind of start explicitly thinking, okay, this is the actual kind of research work that we're going to do. So it's going to take the kind of modeling frameworks and emissions data that's there in the literature, and then the research itself will be to kind of do the statistical modeling and for this project say, well, what are the risks associated with some of those uncertainties? How can we have a kind of slightly more nuanced take on them to make sure we don't inadvertently make the wrong decision in our environmental management? the outputs are then going to be the numbers themselves and the write-ups that kind of communicate them. So that's sort of where as a researcher, I previously sort of probably stopped thinking that much beyond that. And as one of the other questions had said, had a maybe slightly more nebulous idea of, you get the numbers out, you put them in a report or a paper, and then hopefully there's some kind of diffusion of that knowledge, and it eventually leads to positive actions in reality. But by mapping it out like this, I think you're able to be a bit more explicit in, well, how will those outputs actually result in outcomes, and are there ways that we can try and ensure that those outputs are provided in a way that really will result in outcome. So I think, as you can see here, there's kind of two streams to the outcomes, and one of them is that slightly broader one where you put academic literature out there and hope that it's useful to other people. But also it's being a bit more explicit and saying, well, for our key stakeholders, they actually want these numbers to feed into their plans. And so if we provide them with those numbers, then the immediate outcome is hopefully they are incorporated and contribute to the progress of things like the climate action plan for DERA in Northern Ireland being finished, and then through the goal kind of being translated into the actual net zero pathway. And then in the longer term, kind of, I guess within the sprint, we can provide them in the outcomes, and hopefully it will be incorporated as a kind of meeting that goal within the sprint timeline, and then having actual kind of policy and on the ground action resulting from that is kind of the longer term impact. So hopefully by contributing this mathematical modeling that supports the climate action plan, that gets taken up, and then eventually that translates to sort of actual on the ground action in Northern Ireland that will result in sort of environmentally positive land use pathways that help contribute to the climate change mitigation targets. So it's been very useful to map that out. I mean, partly to keep the sprint going successfully and show that we're thinking about these things. But in terms of sort of wider research expectations at the moment, there is sort of, and across other projects I'm involved in that don't have as kind of quick turnaround policy framing as the sprints do, there does seem to be an increasing request to talk about what impacts you're having and how you're lining up for kind of genuine action to result, and having this sort of slightly more systematic framing of it than I maybe previously did has been quite useful in successfully communicating that. So yeah, I hope there's obviously a lot else going on in there, but hopefully that's given a sense of how we went about it for this project and how it's been useful and continue to be used. And then one of the other useful takeaways is kind of thinking a bit more critically about the assumptions and risks that were involved in the project. So I think inevitably there will always be some things that are delayed or go a bit off track or need a bit of reconfiguration within any research project. And I suppose for a kind of quite rapid one like this, you have to be even more aware of that, taking things off course within the quick timeline. So in some ways, the assumptions are kind of both generic and research specific, because it's to do with, well, how can you actually undertake the analysis that the whole project is built around? So there's still kind of the research element there. But it's also been handy to think about how, well, if we're building it around an expectation that we can provide specific outputs that will be taken up and used by our stakeholders, then how can we try and overcome the risks in a way that will still provide them? So things like the key ones that we noted here were, well, one of the reasons for doing the research has been that there isn't that much out there on the kind of emissions uncertainty. That's a strength of the research in one way, because it's what we're trying to address, but it's also a risk in that, well, what if we just can't build much from it? So in the kind of the designing the research itself, kind of thought through different pathways in terms of, well, for whatever level of detail we can find and build in, how can we ensure that they will still end up being useful for those stakeholder needs? A slightly bigger assumption and risk is the kind of the whole political context changing. But I think and has so far proved to be the case that despite ongoing political changes in Northern Ireland, the context is still there for the climate action plan to be supported through this bit of research. But again, it was another thing to have in mind. And okay, if some of the details change shape along the way, we still have that core output in terms of fulfilling the needs as stated in the climate action plan and as mapped out in the theory of change. Okay, yeah, so I think hopefully that is all helpful illustration for everyone.
There's a final slide that just gives you a few resources that I have drawn on a lot over the years when I've been talking about theory of change within research. These are all available. They're all available online. There's some good stuff out there, but these are probably some of the key things that I would recommend that you turn to if you're thinking about theory of change in relation to research projects. Thank you hugely to John for his time in sharing his experiences with you, and I really wish you all the very best.